The coffee machine hissed, a sharp, metallic sound that felt too loud for 7 in the morning. I watched the dark liquid drip into the carafe, counting the seconds. In my line of work, you learn to appreciate the predictable. Regulations don't have moods. Compliance doesn't wake up one day and decide it doesn't like the way you breathe. Lena was already at the kitchen island, her fingers tracing the rim of an empty mug. She hadn't looked at me when I walked in. She hadn't said good morning. She was staring at a pile of mail as if the envelopes contained a coded warning she couldn't quite decipher. "The Hendersons' pool party starts at 2, I said, keeping my voice level. "Do we need to pick anything up on the way?" Lena didn't look up. "Harper says she's tired. She might stay home." "She's 18, I said. "She can make her own choices. But the Hendersons are expecting us. It's a networking thing for your studio, remember?" Lena finally glanced at me, and for a split second, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't there last week. It wasn't anger. It was a flicker of appraisal, like she was looking at a piece of furniture that might be infested with rot. She looked away just as quickly. "We'll see," she murmured. I poured my coffee. I didn't push it. As a compliance analyst, I deal with anomalies. When a distributor's numbers don't align with the shipping manifests, you don't start shouting. You observe. You look for the pattern. Right now, the pattern in my own house was shifting. The atmosphere had become heavy, pressurized like the air, before a massive storm system rolls in across the plains. I walked toward the stairs, my footsteps muffled by the hallway runner. As I passed Harper's room, the door was cracked open an inch. I saw her sitting on the edge of her bed, her phone a bright rectangle of light against her face. She didn't look up, but she knew I was there. "Morning, Harper," I said. She didn't move her head, but I saw her thumb pause on the screen. "Hey, Derek." Her voice was flat, devoid of the performative cheer she usually used when she wanted something. There was a sharpness to the silence that followed. I waited for a beat, expecting the usual request for gas money or a complaint about the Wi-Fi speed. It didn't come. I kept moving toward my home office. The morning passed in a blur of spreadsheets and regulatory updates. I focused on a discrepancy in a shipment of heart valves destined for a surgical center in Ohio. It was clean work, logic-based. If $1 doesn't match $B, there is a reason. Someone bypassed a protocol. Someone thought they were smarter than the system. They never are. The system is designed to catch the outliers eventually. Around noon, the house went quiet. I heard the garage door open and close. Lena and Harper were leaving. I checked my watch. They were early for the party, or perhaps they were going somewhere else first. They hadn't told me. I took a shower, dressed in a polo shirt and khakis, the uniform of the invisible middle-aged man, and drove myself to the Hendersons. The neighborhood was one of those affluent enclaves where the grass is surgically maintained and the silence is expensive. When I arrived, the backyard was already full. The smell of charcoal and expensive sunscreen hung in the stagnant July air. I saw Lena standing near the outdoor bar, a glass of white wine held tightly in her hand. She was talking to Sarah Henderson, but her eyes were scanning the crowd. Harper was by the pool, surrounded by a group of friends. They were all teenagers or college students, a cluster of tan limbs and expensive sunglasses. Harper was the center of the orbit. She was talking, her gestures wide and animated, a complete contrast to the hushed girl I'd seen in her bedroom 3 hours earlier. I grabbed a bottled water and made my way toward Lena. As I approached, the conversation between her and Sarah's situation ended suddenly and awkwardly. "Derek?" Sarah said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "So glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss the annual chlorine summit," I said, trying for my usual dry delivery. Lena didn't laugh. She didn't even crack a smile. She took a long sip of her wine and looked over my shoulder at the pool. "Harper's been telling me about her college applications again. She's stressed." "She's smart," I said. "She'll get in wherever she wants. She knows how to present a case." Lena's grip on her glass tightened until her knuckles were white. Is that what you think she does? Presents cases? The tone was a direct challenge. I felt the first real spike of alarm. This wasn't just a bad mood. This was a foundation beginning to crack. I think she's a capable young woman, Lena. What's going on? Nothing, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Just stay over here for a while. Let her have her space. I looked at the pool. Harper was looking directly at me now. She wasn't smiling anymore. She whispered something to the girl next to her, a girl named Maya, who I'd driven home from soccer practice a dozen times over the years. Maya looked at me, her expression shifting from curiosity to a sharp, visible disgust. I stood my ground, my analyst's brain clicking into high gear. I began to catalog the variables, the sudden silence, the distance, the way Harper was positioned, always in a group, always visible, always making sure I was the one standing alone. I moved toward the food table, picking up a plate I didn't want. I felt the eyes of the other parents on me. It was subtle, a glance that lingered a second too long, a conversation that hushed as I walked past. I was a ghost at a feast. I saw Rick Henderson, a guy I'd played golf with once a month for 3 years. He was standing by the grill. Usually he'd wave me over to talk about the market or his backswing. Today, he stayed focused on the burgers, his back turned to me with an intentionality that was impossible to miss. I sat on a stone bench near the edge of the patio, far enough away from the pool to be out of the splash zone, but close enough to be part of the party. Or so I thought. Harper began to move. She climbed out of the pool, dripping water onto the flagstone. She didn't grab a towel. She walked straight toward the center of the patio, where the largest group of adults was gathered. Lena was there. Sarah and Rick were there. I watched her. My heart wasn't racing. It was steady, a rhythmic thrum in my chest. I felt a cold clarity settling over me. I knew the moment the air changed. It was like a physical weight dropping onto the yard. Harper stopped in front of her mother. She looked small, shivering slightly despite the heat. She looked vulnerable. It was a masterpiece of body language. Mom? Harper's voice wasn't loud, but it had a frequency that cut through the ambient noise of the party. The music didn't stop, but the talking did. It rippled outward from her like a wave. Lena stepped toward her, her face full of a frantic, desperate concern. What is it, honey? What's wrong? Harper didn't look at Lena. She looked at me. She pointed a finger, her hand trembling just enough to be noticed by everyone within 20 feet. I can't do this anymore, Harper said, her voice rising, cracking perfectly. I can't stay in that house with him. Not after what he did. Not after what he keeps doing. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop. I sat on my stone bench, a plate of untouched potato salad in my lap, and I didn't move. I didn't drop the plate. I didn't gasp. I simply looked at her. I saw the way Lena's face transformed. The doubt she'd been carrying all morning solidified into a hard, polished granite. She didn't ask for evidence. She didn't ask for a date or a time. She looked at her daughter, and then she looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. Derek, Lena whispered, the word sounding like a curse. Around the pool, people began to stand up. Rick Henderson stepped away from the grill, his face dark. The teenagers by the water were staring at me, their phones already out, their thumbs moving. I looked at Harper. Behind the tears, behind the shaking shoulders, I saw it. Just for a second. A flicker of triumph. A data point that didn't fit the narrative of a victim. She was watching for my reaction. She wanted the collapse. She wanted the shouting, the denials, the frantic pleading of a man who sees his life disappearing. I gave her nothing. I set the plate down on the bench beside me. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my shirt. My hands were perfectly still. I looked at the crowd, at the friends who were already mentally erasing my phone number, at the wife who had abandoned a decade of marriage in 10 seconds. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The accusation had been launched, and in the eyes of everyone in this zip code, I was already convicted. I turned and walked toward the gate. I could feel their eyes on my back, a heavy, stinging pressure. I heard Lena start to sob, and I heard the murmurs of comfort rising up to meet her. I heard Harper's voice, lower now, beginning the performance of the details. I reached my car and sat in the driver's seat. I didn't start the engine. I took out a small notebook from the center console and a pen. My hand was steady. July 5th, 2:42 p.m., I wrote. Public accusation. Witness count, approximately 40. Subject, Harper Vaughn. Primary believer, Lena Vaughn. I closed the notebook. The panic that should have been there was absent. In its place was something much more useful. A cold, analytical vacuum. They thought they had destroyed me. They thought they had ended the story before I could even speak. They were wrong. The audit had only just begun. The drive home was conducted in a silence so absolute it felt structural. I kept my eyes on the road, maintaining exactly 3 miles per hour above the limit, the threshold where local patrol officers generally lose interest. My hands remained at 10 and 2. I did not turn on the radio. I did not check my phone. I simply processed the data from the backyard. The variables had shifted, and the previous life I had inhabited was now a closed file. I pulled into the driveway, parked, and entered the house. It was empty. The air conditioning hummed, a steady, indifferent vibration that felt like the only honest thing left in the building. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. I stood there for a long time, looking at the magnet on the refrigerator that held a photograph of Lena, Harper, and me from a trip to the Grand Canyon 3 years ago. We looked like a demographic. We looked like a success story. I took the magnet off, placed the photo face down on the counter, and walked to the master bedroom. I didn't pack a suitcase. Packing a suitcase implies a temporary displacement or a frantic retreat. Instead, I pulled a duffel bag from the closet and began a systematic retrieval of essential items. I took enough clothes for a week, my secondary laptop, and the accordion folder from the floor safe that contained my birth certificate, passport, and the title to my car. The front door heavy thudded open 20 minutes later. I didn't stop folding my shirts. I heard the sharp, rhythmic strike of Lena's heels on the hardwood, followed by the softer, hesitant gait of Harper. They were in the foyer. The tension they brought with them was a physical presence, a change in the house's barometric pressure. "Derek!" Lena's voice didn't sound like her own. It was frayed, stretched thin by a mixture of shock and a sudden, fierce righteousness. I zipped the duffel bag and walked out to the landing. I looked down at them. Lena was standing at the foot of the stairs, her face flushed, her eyes wet and rimmed with a hard, judgmental light. Harper stood 3 feet behind her, her head bowed, her shoulders pulled in. She looked like the picture of a broken spirit. It was an excellent performance. If I hadn't seen the look in her eyes at the pool, that brief, razor-sharp flash of victory, I might have believed it too. "I'm here, Lena," I said. My voice was calm. It was the voice I used when explaining a regulatory bypass to a regional manager. "Get out," she said. It wasn't a scream. It was a command. "I want you out of this house. Now. I've already called my brother. He's on his way." "Your brother is a high school gym coach with a short fuse," I said. "Having him here will only complicate the legalities of the evening. I'm already leaving." "Legalities?" Lena stepped onto the first stair, her hand gripping the banister. "Is that all you have to say? No denial? No explanation? You just want to talk about the logistics of leaving?" "A denial requires an audience willing to weigh evidence," I replied, looking directly at her. "You decided I was a monster the moment she spoke. You didn't look at me for a single second to see if I was confused or hurt. You looked at me to see how much you should hate me. The trial is over, Lena. You gave the verdict before the defense could even stand up." "She's my daughter!" Lena yelled, the sound echoing off the high ceiling of the foyer. "And I was your husband," I said. I started down the stairs, the duffel bag slung over my shoulder. As I reached the bottom, Harper shrank back against the wall. She let out a small, jagged breath, a sound designed to trigger Lena's protective instincts. It worked perfectly. Lena stepped between us, her chest heaving. "Don't you go near her!" Lena hissed. I stopped 2 feet away. I didn't look at Lena. I looked past her, straight into Harper's eyes. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. She didn't look afraid. She looked curious. She was waiting for me to break, to cry, to beg Lena to listen. She wanted to see the impact of her work. "You've been very thorough, Harper," I said quietly. The timing at the party was a calculated choice. Maximum social damage with minimum opportunity for a private conversation. It was efficient. "Shut up!" Lena shouted. "Don't talk to her like she's one of your spreadsheets. Get out before I call the police." "The police would be a logical next step," I said, turning my gaze back to Lena. "In fact, I'm surprised you haven't called them already. If you truly believe what she said, you have a legal obligation to report it. Why haven't you?" Lena hesitated. The righteousness flickered. I wanted you gone first. I wanted her safe." "No," I said. "You haven't called them because deep down, in the part of your brain that still functions on logic, you know that a police investigation involves forensics, interviews, and a search for consistency. You know that once the state gets involved, the narrative is no longer under your control. You prefer the version where you get to be the protector and I get to be the villain, without the messy interference of facts." "Out!" Lena pointed at the door. Her hand was shaking. I walked past them. I didn't look back. I opened the front door and stepped out into the humid evening. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawns of the cul-de-sac. I saw a neighbor, Mr. Henderson's brother-in-law, standing across the street. He was holding a garden hose, but he wasn't watering anything. He was watching me. The contagion had already spread. I got into my car, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway. I drove to a mid-range hotel 10 miles away, a place that catered to business travelers and people in transition. I checked in under my own name, using my personal credit card. I had nothing to hide, and creating a paper trail of my movements was the first step in the counter process. My room was on the 3rd floor, overlooking a parking lot and a strip mall. It was clean, beige, and entirely neutral. I sat at the small desk and opened my laptop. I didn't feel the weight of the day. I felt a strange, cold buoyancy. When you lose everything in a single afternoon, the fear of loss disappears. You are left with a very specific kind of freedom. I opened a new encrypted cloud drive and labeled it Project Audit. I began by listing the timeline of the last 48 hours. I noted every comment Harper had made, every shift in Lena's behavior, every discrepancy in the domestic routine. I remembered the way Harper had been stressed about college apps, yet her browser history, which I had seen briefly while helping her with a printer issue a week ago, had been focused on local apartment rentals and emancipation laws. I spent 4 hours documenting. I didn't use emotional language. I used the language of my profession: observation, discrepancy, potential motivation. Around midnight, I sat back and looked at the screen. The accusation wasn't an isolated event. It was the climax of a sequence. Harper wanted something. She wanted independence, or she wanted to punish a perceived slight, or she wanted to exert a level of power she hadn't yet tasted. And Lena, in her desperate need to be the good mother to a daughter who had always been a mystery to her, had jumped at the chance to prove her loyalty. I realized then that the accusation wasn't just a lie. It was a tool. I stood up and went to the window. The streetlights flickered in the parking lot. I thought about my house, the one I had paid for, the one I had maintained, the one I was now barred from. I thought about my reputation, which was currently being dismantled in group chats and over kitchen tables across the city. In a normal story, this is where the protagonist tries to find a lawyer to prove his innocence. This is where he calls his friends and begs them to believe him. I did none of those things. I knew my friends. I knew the people in our social circle. They weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in the excitement of a scandal. They would feast on this. They would use my fall to feel better about their own mediocre lives. Trying to convince them would be like trying to talk a shark out of a feeding frenzy. I turned away from the window and looked at my notebook. If they wanted a monster, I wouldn't give them one. If they wanted a victim, they would be disappointed. I would be a mirror. I would reflect their own hypocrisies and their own failures back at them until they couldn't stand the sight. I reached into my duffel bag and pulled out a small digital recorder I used for work memos. I set it on the desk. "Entry 1, I said, my voice steady in the empty room. The accusation was rehearsed. The audience was curated. The believer was chosen for her volatility. The goal was my immediate removal from the household and the seizure of the social narrative." I paused, thinking of Harper's face. "I will not defend the old life," I continued. "The old life is a total loss. I am now focused on the recovery of assets, social, financial, and personal. I will not seek forgiveness because no offense was committed. I will not seek reconciliation because the bridge was burned by the other party. I will simply follow the data to its logical conclusion." I turned off the recorder. The realization hit me then, a cold, hard fact that settled in the pit of my stomach. Harper hadn't come up with this on her own. She was smart, but she was impulsive. This plan had a level of structural integrity that didn't match her usual patterns. Someone had coached her. Someone had shown her where the pressure points were. Someone else wanted me gone. I sat back down at the laptop. I didn't feel tired. I felt like a machine that had just been switched to a higher voltage. I began to look at our shared bank accounts, our phone logs, and our cloud storage. I wasn't hacking. I had the passwords. We were a family. We shared everything. By 3:00 a.m., I found the first anomaly, a series of deleted messages between Lena and an old friend from her art school days, a man who had resurfaced 6 months ago as a consultant for her studio. The messages were gone, but the data usage spikes and the timestamps remained. I leaned into the glow of the monitor. The pattern was emerging. The accusation wasn't just a daughter's whim, it was a displacement strategy. I didn't feel angry. I felt a profound sense of relief. Anger is messy. Anger makes you sloppy. Compliance, however, is a cold game, and I was the best analyst in the firm. I closed the laptop and lay down on the stiff hotel bed. I didn't sleep, but I rested. I watched the shadows of cars passing on the highway crawl across the ceiling. I was no longer Derek Vaughn, the husband and stepfather who liked grilling on Sundays and worrying about the mortgage. I was the auditor. And the first bill was coming due. The morning light in the hotel room was thin and gray, filtered through heavy polyester curtains that smelled of industrial detergent. I woke up exactly 4 minutes before my alarm. My mind was already clear, the previous night's data points standing like frozen statues in a gallery. I did not experience that familiar second of confusion people often describe when waking in a strange place. I knew exactly where I was, why I was there, and what the next 3 steps had to be. In my profession, you learn that the biggest mistakes happen in the transition between shock and action. I had bypassed the shock entirely. I dressed in a charcoal suit, the fabric crisp and armor-like. It was a uniform of competence. I sat at the desk and made a call to Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a forensic accountant I had worked with during a medical billing fraud case 3 years ago. He was a man who viewed human emotions as inconvenient friction in an otherwise elegant system of numbers. "Derek," Marcus said, his voice sounding like gravel being turned in a mixer. "I saw the social media chatter. People in our circle are talking. Or rather, they are screaming. Let them scream, Marcus. It's a high-frequency noise that masks the real movement. I need a digital deep dive on a specific set of credentials. I have the authorization for the accounts. They are joint assets. But I need the metadata. I need to know not just what was said, but the geolocation of the devices when the messages were deleted. You're looking for a conspiracy, not just a lie, Marcus noted. There was no judgment in his tone, only professional curiosity. I'm looking for the architect, I said. Harper is the façade, Lena is the emotional labor, but the structure has a professional finish I don't recognize. I'll send you the encrypted link in 10 minutes. I ended the call and headed to the law offices of Miller and Associates. My appointment was with a procedural specialist, not a high-profile litigator. I didn't want a performer, I wanted a mechanic. The waiting room was filled with the scent of expensive leather and old paper. When I was called into the office, the attorney, a woman named Claire with silver hair and eyes that looked like they had seen every possible variation of human failure, didn't offer a handshake. She simply gestured to the chair. The accusation is severe, Mr. Vaughn, Claire said, opening a folder. In the current climate, the burden of proof has shifted. Socially, you are already a pariah. Legally, we are in a defensive crouch until a formal charge is filed. Has that happened? No, I said, and it won't. A formal charge requires a statement under penalty of perjury and an investigation by people who are trained to spot coach testimony. My stepdaughter and my wife want the social execution. They don't want a courtroom where I have the right to cross-examine. I'm here to discuss asset protection and a preemptive filing for divorce based on irreconcilable differences and bad faith. Claire leaned back. You're moving very fast. Most men in your position are still in the how could they phase. I've already processed the how, I said. Now I'm managing the what next. I need a temporary restraining order regarding the house, not to get back in, but to ensure no assets are liquidated or removed while I'm absent. And I need a supervised visit to retrieve my primary server and my hard copy files. That will be tense, she warned. Tension is just a lack of protocol, I said. If we follow the protocol, the tension is irrelevant. By early afternoon, I was parked 2 blocks away from my house. I waited for the text from Claire, confirming that Lena had been served with the notice of the supervised retrieval. It came at 2:14 p.m. I drove the remaining distance, my pulse steady at 68 beats per minute. A silver SUV was parked in my driveway. It belonged to Lena's brother, the gym coach. He was standing on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, his face twisted into a mask of aggressive moral superiority. A police officer stood near the mailbox, looking bored. This was the protocol Claire had insisted upon. A civil standby. I stepped out of my car. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass from the neighbor's yard. I walked toward the porch, my eyes fixed on the door, not on the man trying to provoke a reaction. You've got a lot of nerve coming here, the brother-in-law said, his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. If it were up to me, you wouldn't be walking away from this. I didn't stop. I didn't look at him. The court order allows me 90 minutes. I suggest you step aside so we don't have to involve the officer in a secondary matter of obstruction. He bristled, his face turning a dark shade of red, but the officer cleared his throat and made a small, waving motion with his hand. The brother-in-law stepped back, muttering something under his breath that I didn't care to record. Inside, the house felt different. The air was stagnant, and there was a clutter on the kitchen island that I would never have allowed. Empty wine bottles, fast food wrappers, a pile of crumpled tissues, the physical manifestation of a domestic collapse. Lena was standing in the living room. She looked exhausted, her eyes sunken, and her hair unwashed. Harper was nowhere to be seen, likely tucked away in her room, playing the part of the traumatized ward. How can you be so cold? Lena asked, her voice a hollow rasp. You walk in here with your suit and your lawyers. You haven't even asked how she is. I know exactly how she is, Lena, I said, heading toward my office. She is currently experiencing the adrenaline of a successful maneuver. It's a powerful stimulant, but it has a very short half-life. Eventually, the reality of the logistics will set in. "You're a sociopath," she whispered. I stopped at the office door and turned to look at her. "No, I'm an analyst. A sociopath would have enjoyed the scene at the pool. I found it inefficient and distasteful. A sociopath would lie to you. I'm the only one in this house currently providing you with the truth, but you've decided that the truth is an attack." I entered the office and closed the door. I had 82 minutes left. I ignored the desk and went straight to the bookshelf. Behind a row of dusty volumes on medical ethics sat my primary NAS, the network-attached storage that mirrored all our home devices. I disconnected it, wrapping the cables neatly. I then turned to the filing cabinet. I pulled the folders for the last 5 years of tax returns, the studio's rental agreements, and the tuition payments for Harper's private schooling. As I reached for the final drawer, I saw a small blue USB drive sitting in the pencil tray. It wasn't mine. I didn't recognize it. I picked it up and tucked it into my pocket. I spent the remaining time clearing out my personal documents. I didn't take anything that wasn't strictly mine. I didn't touch the art books or the family mementos. I was stripping the house of my presence, one file at a time. When I emerged, the brother-in-law was in the hallway. He tried to shoulder into my space, a clumsy attempt at physical intimidation. I stopped, looked at the officer through the front door, and then looked back at him. He backed off, his bravado failing in the face of my lack of fear. I walked out to my car, loaded the boxes, and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Back at the hotel, I set up the server. The blue USB drive was my first priority. I plugged it into a sanitized laptop, one not connected to the internet. The drive contained a single folder labeled Notes. Inside were dozens of screenshots. They weren't of messages or emails. They were screenshots of a digital diary. Harper's diary. I began to read. My eyes moved across the screen with the same mechanical precision I used for auditing shipping manifests. June 12th. Mom is complaining about the studio expenses again. She says Derek is tightening the belt. He's so boring. Everything is a budget. Everything is a rule. If he were gone, she wouldn't have to worry about the numbers. June 18th. Talk to Julian. He says there are ways to handle people like Derek. He says men like him are easy to break because they rely on their good guy image. If you take that away, they have nothing. July 1st. Julian showed me how to phrase it. Not too specific. Just enough to make people imagine the rest. Mom will believe anything if I cry hard enough. She hates conflict, and she'll hate him for making her deal with it. I stared at the name. Julian. Julian Vaughn was the consultant Lena had hired for her art studio, the man with the deleted messages, the architect. I sat back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses. The pattern was now complete. This wasn't just a daughter's rebellion or a wife's emotional lapse. It was a targeted removal. Julian Vaughn wanted access to Lena's assets, and I was the regulatory barrier standing in his way. By using Harper as the weapon, he had removed the barrier and secured the loyalty of the remaining parties in one move. It was a clever plan. It relied on the assumption that I would react like a normal man, with shame, with anger, with a desperate attempt to clear my name that would only make me look more guilty in the court of public opinion. But I wasn't a normal man. I was an auditor, and I had just found the fraud. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus. "I have a name," I said. "Julian Vaughn. I need everything, every debt, every failed business venture, every former associate. I want to see the rot beneath the polish." "I'm on it," Marcus said. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to let them think they've won," I said. "I'm going to let them get comfortable in the wreckage, and then I'm going to start the liquidation." I hung up. I felt a strange, cold humming in my limbs. It wasn't excitement. It was the feeling of a machine reaching its optimal operating temperature. I looked at the screenshots on the screen. Harper's words, Julian's coaching, Lena's blind compliance. They had detonated my life because they thought I was a small man who followed small rules. They thought my quietness was weakness. They were about to learn that the quietest people are the ones who spend the most time listening. And I had heard everything. The conference room at the high school felt like a vacuum. It was a small, windowless space that smelled of floor wax and old upholstery. I sat on one side of the laminated table, my posture mirroring the rigid geometry of the room. Across from me sat Mrs. Gable, the head counselor, and Mr. Sterling, the principal. They both looked as though they were bracing for a physical impact. "Mr. Vaughn," Mr. Sterling began, his hands clasped tightly over a manila folder. "Given the nature of the allegations circulating, we felt it was necessary to discuss Harper's status and your—" "I'm not here to discuss rumors," I interrupted. My voice was a flat, administrative instrument. "I am here to provide the institution with a series of documented facts that pertain to the safety and academic integrity of a student. As Harper's legal stepfather and the individual currently providing her tuition, I have a fiduciary and parental interest in ensuring the school is not being used as a staging ground for a coordinated fraud." Mrs. Gable blinked. She had likely expected a man in tears, or a man in a rage. "Fraud is a very strong word, Mr. Vaughn." "It is a precise word," I corrected. I opened my briefcase and laid out 3 sets of documents, color-coded and stapled. This first packet contains a series of time-stamped screenshots from a digital diary recovered from a shared device in my home. You will notice the entries from June 12th through July 1st. They outline a specific plan to manufacture a social crisis to remove me from the home. You will also see references to a Julian, who provided the phrasing for the accusations. I watched their eyes track the text. The air in the room seemed to thin even further. Mr. Sterling's face lost its mask of professional concern and replaced it with a look of profound, bureaucratic panic. "This second packet," I continued, "is a log of Harper's school-issued laptop activity. It shows she was researching emancipation laws and housing grants during her AP calculus periods. And the third packet is a summary of a forensic audit regarding her mother's art studio, which reveals a series of financial irregularities linked to a consultant named Julian Vaughn. The motive for my removal was not my conduct, but my oversight of the family's assets. This is—" Mrs. Gable trailed off, her eyes fixed on a screenshot where Harper described the performance she planned to give at the pool party. "It is a documentation of a sequence," I said. "I am not asking for your sympathy. I am informing you that I am filing this evidence with the district's legal counsel this afternoon. I expect Harper to be offered the appropriate psychological counseling, but I will no longer be responsible for the tuition payments for an individual who has explicitly documented her intent to defraud me. You will find the formal withdrawal of financial support on the final page." I stood up. I didn't wait for them to find their words. I had already achieved the goal. The school was now a witness. They could no longer pretend they were protecting a victim. They were now managing a liability. The next stop was the art studio. The studio was a refurbished warehouse space on the edge of the downtown district. It was high-ceilinged and airy, filled with the smell of turpentine and expensive potential. When I walked in, the bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, ignorant sound. Lena was standing at a large canvas, her back to me. Julian Vaughn was standing close to her, his hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be comforting but looked entirely proprietary. He was a man of manufactured elegance, linen shirts, expensive haircuts, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Lena," I said. They both spun around. Lena's face went pale, her hand flying to her throat. Julian stepped forward, his chest puffing out in a display of protective posturing that was almost comical in its predictability. "You shouldn't be here, Derek," Julian said, his voice smooth and condescending. "We have witnesses. You're violating every boundary." "I'm not here for a conversation with the help, Julian," I said. I walked to the center of the room, ignoring him entirely. I looked at Lena. The divorce filing was served an hour ago. Along with it, a freeze has been placed on all joint accounts, including the operating budget for this studio. Since the studio is technically an LLC funded by marital assets, an independent auditor will be arriving tomorrow morning to review the books. Lena's eyes widened. The books? Derek, what are you doing? We're in the middle of a gallery push. You're in the middle of a collapse, I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, portable projector. I aimed it at the white wall behind her canvas. What is this? Julian demanded, moving toward the device. It's a presentation, I said. I clicked a button, and the wall was flooded with the screenshots of Harper's diary. The room went silent. I watched Lena read the words. I watched her see her own daughter's handwriting, digital but unmistakable, describing how she would manipulate her mother's conflict-avoidant nature. I watched her see Julian's name mentioned as the coach, the man who told her that good guys are the easiest to break. Julian? Lena whispered, her voice trembling. It's fake, Julian snapped, though I could see the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. He's a compliance guy, Lena. He lives for this. He probably fabricated the whole thing to get back at us. The metadata is verified by a third-party forensic firm, I said, my voice cutting through his protest like a scalpel. The IP addresses match the devices in our home and the Wi-Fi in this studio. But more importantly, Lena, look at the bank transfers. I clicked the remote again. A spreadsheet appeared on the wall. It showed a series of consulting fees paid from the studio account to a shell company owned by Julian Vaughn. The amounts were just below the threshold that usually triggers an internal bank alert. He wasn't protecting you, Lena, I said. He was clearing the field so he could harvest what was left. He used Harper's resentment of my rules to give himself a path to your money. And you let him. You chose to believe a lie because the lie felt more dramatic than the truth. Lena turned to Julian. The look on her face wasn't anger yet. It was something worse, the slow, agonizing realization that she had been the architect of her own ruin. Is this true? She asked. Julian didn't answer. He looked at the wall, then at me. The mask of the elegant consultant was gone, replaced by the panicked look of a cornered animal. You think you've won? You're still the guy everyone hates, Derek. You think a few spreadsheets change what people think of you? I don't care what people think of me, I said, and for the first time in years, the statement was entirely true. I care about the accuracy of the record. The record now shows that you are a fraud, and Harper is a collaborator. The social narrative will catch up to the data eventually. But for now, the money is gone. Derek, please, Lena said, stepping toward me. We can talk about this. I was confused. I was scared. I looked at her, and I felt a profound sense of nothingness. There was no flicker of the affection I had once felt. There was no urge to comfort her. She was a component that had failed under pressure. She was an unreliable asset. There is no we, Lena, I said. You made a choice in the backyard. You stood in front of a crowd and you abandoned a decade of partnership without asking a single question. You don't get to return to the table once you've forfeited your seat. I turned to Julian. As for you, the auditor will be looking for the consulting fees to be returned. If they aren't, the matter moves from civil to criminal. I suggest you start looking for a different kind of lawyer. I picked up the projector and walked toward the door. Wait, Lena called out. Where are you going? What about Harper? I stopped at the door, but I didn't turn around. Harper is 18. She wanted to be an adult. She wanted to play adult games with adult consequences. She can explain her actions to the school board and the community. I'm moving my things out of the hotel and into a new apartment this evening. Do not contact me. I stepped out into the afternoon sun. The street was busy, filled with people going about their lives, oblivious to the fact that a small, quiet world had just been systematically dismantled. I drove to a nearby park and sat on a bench. I took out my notebook. July 10th. 3:15 p.m. I wrote. Disclosure complete. Subjects informed of the evidence. Emotional collapse of primary believer observed. Flight response noted in secondary subject, Julian. Narrative reversal initiated. I sat there for a long time, watching the wind move through the trees. I thought about the man I had been 2 weeks ago. That man would have been devastated. That man would have spent his nights wondering why his family didn't love him. That man was gone. In his place was someone who understood the true nature of the world. It wasn't about love or loyalty or doing the right thing. It was about the control of information. It was about who held the keys to the record. I felt a strange, cold peace. I was no longer the victim of a lie. I was the author of a reckoning. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from a former friend, one of the men from the pool party who had looked at me with such disgust. Derek, I heard something about a diary. Is it true? Look, man, if I overreacted, I'm sorry. We should grab a drink. I didn't reply. I blocked the number. The social perception was shifting, just as I had predicted. The people who had been so quick to condemn me were now looking for a way to be on the right side of the new truth. They were vultures looking for a different carcass. I stood up and walked back to my car. The investigation was over, but the revenge was only beginning. The truth was out. But the truth wasn't the goal. The goal was the total systematic destruction of the people who thought they could erase me. I had the evidence. I had the assets, and I had the time. The silence of my new apartment was a tactical advantage. It was a sterile, high-rise unit with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city's financial district. There were no family photographs, no mismatched furniture, and no echoes of previous arguments. It was a space designed for focus. I sat at my desk, the surface clear except for 3 separate burner phones and my primary laptop. The digital audit of Julian Vaughn had yielded more than just financial discrepancies. It had provided a roadmap of his vulnerabilities. Julian was a man built on the concept of social leverage. He didn't just want money. He wanted the proximity to influence that Lena's circle provided. To destroy a man like that, you don't take his life. You take his audience. You make him a liability to the very people he spent years courting. I began with the country club. It was the hub of our former social life, a place where reputation was the only currency that mattered. I knew the board of directors. I had audited their procurement contracts as a favor 2 years prior. I drafted a formal memorandum. I didn't mention the accusation against me. Instead, I focused on the conflict of interest involving a primary member's consultant. I attached the bank statements showing the shell company transfers and the unauthorized access to the studio's charitable foundation funds. I sent it at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. By noon, Julian's membership had been placed under administrative review. By 2 p.m., the gossip mill had shifted its focus. I wasn't the monster anymore. I was the victim of a sophisticated con artist, and Julian was the predator. The speed of the reversal was almost disappointing. People are so eager to be on the side of the righteous that they don't care which direction the righteousness is pointed. Next, I turned my attention to the physical markers of their betrayal. Lena's art studio was more than a business. It was her identity. I had already frozen the accounts, but the lease was held in my name. I called the landlord. The space is being vacated, I told him. I'm exercising the early termination clause due to the unauthorized commercial activities of a third party. But the equipment, the canvases, the landlord began. Anything left in the space after Friday will be considered abandoned property and liquidated to cover the termination fees, I said. I was stripping the terrain. I was making the world around Lena and Harper as small and as cold as the one they had tried to trap me in. I felt a rhythmic, mechanical satisfaction as each piece of the puzzle was removed. It was like cleaning a complex piece of machinery, removing the grit, the rust, and the unnecessary wait. On Thursday, I received a series of voicemails from Lena. Her voice progressed from indignant to pleading, and finally to a jagged, hollow desperation. I didn't listen to them past the first few seconds. I merely transcribed the metadata: time, duration, and frequency. They were data points in a pattern of harassment that I was documenting for the final hearing. Harper was a different problem. She was young enough to be perceived as a victim of Julian's influence, but old enough to have known exactly what she was doing. She had used the language of modern accountability to silence me. I decided to use the same mechanism to expose her. I didn't post on social media. I didn't engage in public shouting matches. Instead, I sent a curated file to the parents of the girl Harper called her best friend, Maya. The file contained the audio recording of Harper from the blue USB drive, where she laughed about how easy it was to make Maya believe the lie. I included the screenshots where Harper called Maya's family useful idiots who would provide her with a place to stay once I was gone. The fallout was instantaneous. By Friday evening, Harper's social circle had evaporated. The support she had cultivated was replaced by a sharp, icy exclusion. In the age of digital permanence, a betrayal of friendship is often seen as more unforgivable than a betrayal of a parent. Saturday morning was the peak of the thermal cycle. I drove to the studio one last time. I didn't go inside. I parked across the street and watched as a moving crew began hauling out the large, expensive canvases. Lena was there, standing on the sidewalk. She looked smaller than I remembered, her expensive clothes wrinkled, her face a mask of exhaustion. Julian was nowhere to be seen. According to Marcus's latest update, Julian had checked out of his apartment and was currently staying in a budget motel on the edge of the county. His credit cards declined, and his professional reputation in ruins. He had tried to reach out to 3 other clients in our circle, but the memorandum I had sent to the club board had preceded him. He was a contaminated asset. No one would touch him. I rolled down my window as Lena spotted my car. She walked toward me, her gait unsteady. She stopped a few feet away, her hands trembling. "You're actually doing it," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the moving truck. "You're taking everything. The studio, the house, the girls' school. You're just turning it all off." "I'm not taking anything, Lena," I said. "I'm simply withdrawing my participation. You decided that my presence was a threat. This is what my absence looks like. It's quiet, it's efficient, it's expensive. She's a child, Derek. Harper made a mistake. She was influenced by Julian." "She's an adult who made a calculation," I countered, "and you are an adult who validated it. You don't get to call for a ceasefire because you're losing the conflict you started. You believed the lie because it was easier than maintaining a marriage. Now you have the lie all to yourself. I hope it keeps you warm." "What do you want?" she cried, a few passers-by turning to look. "Do you want me to beg? Do you want a confession? What will make you stop?" I looked at her, and for a moment, I tried to find the anger she expected. I tried to find the red feeling that people describe in moments of great stress. There was nothing. I felt as if I were looking at a stranger's damaged property. "I don't want anything from you, Lena. That's the part you can't understand. I have no interest in your apologies. I have no interest in your explanations. I am simply closing the accounts. When the balance reaches 0, I'll be gone." I put the car in gear and drove away. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt a sense of completion. The social liquidation was nearly total. That evening, I returned to the apartment and found a man waiting in the lobby. It was Rick Henderson. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from side to side, his expensive golf jacket looking out of place in the sharp, modern architecture of the building. "Derek," he said, stepping forward, I saw the documents the club board circulated, and Maya's parents told me about the audio." I waited. I didn't offer a greeting. "Look, man," Rick said, rubbing the back of his neck. We all feel like idiots. We should have known. I should have stood up for you at the party. I've known you for years. I don't know why I guess we just thought. You thought it was exciting, I said. You thought it was a chance to feel morally superior without having to do any actual work. You saw a man's life being dismantled and you decided to watch the show. It wasn't like that, Rick protested. It was exactly like that, I said. And now that the data has shifted, you're here to perform the ritual of the apology so you don't have to feel like a coward anymore. But I don't need your apology, Rick. I don't value your opinion of me because your opinion is based on the latest available gossip, not on character. Derek, come on. We're friends. We were associates in a social contract that you breached, I said. The contract is terminated. Good night, Rick. I walked past him and entered the elevator. As the doors closed, I saw him standing there, his mouth slightly open, looking at me as if I were a ghost. Upstairs, I opened my laptop. I had one final task for the evening. Julian Vaughn had a secondary bank account, one he had hidden even from his shell companies. It was where he kept his actual escape money. Marcus had found it an hour ago. It wasn't much, but it was enough to trigger a very specific kind of regulatory inquiry if it were reported as unexplained foreign income. I drafted the tip to the IRS. I attached the proof of the concealed transfers and the lack of corresponding tax filings. I hit send. I sat back and watched the city lights. The board was nearly clear. Julian was financially and socially neutralized. Harper was isolated and exposed. Lena was watching her world be dismantled by the very rules she had once relied on me to manage. The revenge wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a gradual, freezing cold. It was the process of removing the heat, the light, and the resources until there was nothing left but the bare, uncomfortable truth. I checked my final checklist. Only one item remained, the final encounter. The peak of the tension where the last illusion would be stripped away. I knew where it would happen, and I knew exactly what I would say. I closed the laptop and stood up. I went to the window and looked out at the grid of the city. Everything was in its place. Everything was in compliance. I felt a strange, quiet hum of anticipation. Not for the end, but for the moment of total control. They had tried to make me a character in their story. The villain, the fool, the obstacle. But I had rewritten the ending, and in my version, there was no mercy. There was only the final, inescapable bill. The house was dark when I arrived, save for a single light in the kitchen. I didn't use my key. I had returned it via certified mail 2 days ago. Instead, I waited on the patio, sitting in the same chair where the accusation had first been hurled. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and late summer humidity. I checked my watch. 9 p.m. The logistics of the final encounter were set. I had sent a single message to both Lena and Harper, informing them I would be coming to collect the remaining legal documents and to provide the final settlement terms. The front door opened, and the hallway light spilled across the lawn. Lena stepped out first, followed closely by Harper. They looked like shadows of the people I had lived with for years. The arrogance was gone. The performance had ended. They approached the patio with the hesitant steps of people walking across a frozen lake, unsure of where the ice might give way. "You're here," Lena said. Her voice was thin, stripped of its previous resonance. She stood at the edge of the stone tiles, refusing to sit. "I am a man of my word, Lena. I told you the audit would be finalized tonight." I gestured to the 2 folders on the table in front of me. "These are the divestment papers. I have already signed them." Harper stood behind her mother, her arms wrapped around her middle. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw no calculation in her eyes. There was only a profound, hollow realization. She had played for high stakes, and had lost the very ground she stood on. "We talked to the school," Harper whispered. "They said the tuition for the fall semester has been canceled. They said there's a board review about my conduct. Action and consequence, Harper, I said. You were the one who insisted on a world where a single statement could change everything. I simply ensured that the statements were accurate and supported by data. You wanted the power of the narrative. Now you have the responsibility that comes with it. She's just a kid, Derek, Lena snapped. But the spark of anger faded almost instantly. It was a reflex, not a conviction. Stop saying that, Lena. It's an insult to her intelligence. She knew exactly how to weaponize your insecurities. She knew exactly how to use Julian to bypass my oversight. She isn't a child. She's a failed strategist. And you weren't a victim. You were a willing participant in your own deception. I pushed the first folder toward Lena. This is the house. I am signing over my equity to you. You can keep it, but you should know that without my income, the property taxes and the maintenance will exceed your studio's current projected revenue by 40%. Within 18 months, the bank will initiate a recovery. I suggest you list it for sale by Monday. Lena stared at the folder. She didn't reach for it. You're giving me the house just to watch me lose it? I'm giving you exactly what you asked for, I said. You wanted me out of your life. You wanted to manage your own affairs without my interference. Here is the paperwork for your independence. It's exactly as heavy as you imagined. I turned to Harper and pushed the second folder toward her. And this is for you. It's a trust fund. It's the money I had set aside for your graduate school and your first home. I've converted it into a restricted educational grant. It can only be used for tuition at a public university. If you choose not to attend, or if you are expelled due to the board review, the funds revert to a charitable foundation for the victims of false testimony. Harper's face crumpled. The reality of the restricted future I had built for her began to sink in. She wouldn't be going to the private arts college in the city. She wouldn't be living in a luxury dorm on my dime. She would be starting over, from the bottom, under the shadow of a record she had created. Why? Lena asked, a single tear tracking down her cheek. Why go this far? You've destroyed Julian. You've shamed us. Why do you have to be so precise? Because precision is the only thing that survives a lie, Lena. You tried to erase my character with a single afternoon of theater. You thought I was a supporting actor in your life. I'm simply making sure that when the curtain falls, the accounting is correct. I stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate. For the first time since this started, I felt the weight of the suit on my shoulders as a comfort, not a burden. I walked to the edge of the patio and looked out at the neighborhood. It was quiet. The Hendersons' house was dark. The social circle had moved on to the next scandal, leaving this one to rot in the sun. There's one more thing, I said, turning back to them. I found the last piece of the puzzle this afternoon. Marcus tracked the original metadata of the document Julian used to coach Harper. It didn't come from Julian's computer. Lena looked up, her brow furrowing. What do you mean? It came from yours, Lena. The template for the accusation, the specific phrases about behavioral shifts and emotional pressure, was drafted in a folder on your cloud drive 3 months ago. You weren't just a believer, Lena. You were the one who gave him the idea. You wanted a way out of the marriage that didn't make you the bad guy. You wanted to be the martyr, not the person who just stopped loving her husband. You indirectly suggested the weapon that your daughter eventually picked up. The silence that followed was different from the others. It was the silence of a vacuum. Lena didn't deny it. She couldn't. The data was there, etched into the timestamps of her own life. She looked down at her hands, the realization of her own indirect culpability finally breaking through the last of her defenses. I didn't think she would actually do it, Lena whispered. I was frustrated. I was talking to Julian about how hard it was with you, always checking the receipts, always asking about the budget. And you gave a predator the blueprints to your own home, I said. You handed him the matches, and then wondered why the house was on fire. I stepped off the patio onto the grass. I didn't feel the need to say anything else. There were no lessons to be learned here, no grand moral realizations that would lead to a better tomorrow. This wasn't a story about growth. It was a story about the terminal stage of a collapse. "Derek!" Harper called out as I reached the gate. Are you just going to leave? What are we supposed to do?" I stopped and looked back at her. She was standing under the porch light, her shadow long and distorted against the white siding of the house. She looked like a stranger. "You do what everyone does when a contract is terminated," I said. "You find a new place to exist, you manage your own risks, and you remember that the record is always being kept." I walked through the gate and to my car. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look at the window of the room that used to be mine. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. The dashboard lit up, a familiar grid of sensors and status lights. Everything was green. Everything was functional. I pulled away from the curb, the tires crunching on the fallen leaves of the street. I drove toward the highway, toward the high-rise apartment and the sterile, quiet life I had constructed. I thought about Julian Vaughn, who was currently being interviewed by investigators regarding his tax filings. I thought about the Hendersons, who were busy pretending they had never met me. I thought about Lena and Harper, sitting in a dark house that they could no longer afford, surrounded by the wreckage of a lie they had both helped build. I felt a profound sense of equilibrium. The accounts were settled. The audit was closed. I reached the highway and merged into the flow of traffic. The city skyline rose up ahead of me, a mountain of glass and light. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't feel like a villain. I felt like a man who had finally reached the end of a very long, very complicated spreadsheet. The total at the bottom was 0. I turned on the cruise control and settled into the lane. The road was straight, the lines were clear, and the path ahead was entirely my own. I didn't need forgiveness. I didn't need an epilogue. The revenge was complete, and for the first time in my life, I was in total compliance with myself. I reached for my notebook on the passenger seat and made one final entry.